there's absolutely no defense for what Russia is doing, considering that Ukraine gave up its nukes in exchange for territorial sovereignty.
Okay, well, let me say something about that. Again, first of all, I'm not, as I want to reiterate, I'm not here to defend what Russia's doing. I am here to explain it, and I think explanations are important. And you raise an important issue. But there have been intervening events which have changed some of what you're talking about. First of all, the interesting thing is that some people think what ended up being the straw that broke the camel's back and led to the invasion was the fact that Zelensky, after he got back from Munich, meeting with, I believe it was Kamala Harris, before the invasion, he came back saying that he was now considering getting nukes. And so Russia saw this and they, felt like, well, we're not going to let that happen. So first of all, he signaled that maybe they weren't going to follow this agreement anymore. We might call it, I'm a lawyer.
Okay, but by the way, just to interrupt, because that's a pretty significant allegation you're making. You're clear on your reporting on that? That yes, Zelensky said that Ukraine is now considering getting nuclear weapons?
Yes, okay. Yes. And that apparently this was what tipped the scales. But even before that, what we have to realize and remember, most of us won't remember because we haven't been told it in the press, is that the war did not start last week. The truth is it started in 2014. In 2014, there was a coup against Yanukovych, I believe was his name, and Poroshenko was installed. The U.S. was behind this. Actually, there's taped conversations with Victoria Nuland, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, where she talks about helping to install the new government in Ukraine and to make sure the right people were there. And this coup resulted in a few things. One was, and this is true, there is a neo-Nazi battalion that's part of the official Ukrainian military after that coup called the Azov Battalion. And in fact, there's a lot, if you watch mainstream media, you'll sometimes see them accidentally, they'll be filming something like you saw that the old lady who was being trained in the machine gun, this was all over TV. You could see the insignia of the Azov Battalion, which it has the two lightning bolts that resemble their neo-Nazi group. But okay,
sorry. The two lightning bolt symbol is a symbol of what?
Of this neo-Nazi group, the Azov Battalion.
Azov Battalion, because I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
And so this is
and this is the thing. No one's familiar with it, though. If you look it up you can find many articles, even in the mainstream press. Once in a while, they've mentioned it. It's a significant battalion. And
when you say battalion, you mean it's part of the Ukrainian military?
It is. It is. And in fact, Zelensky, before the invasion, had just appointed one leader from that battalion as a member of his National Security Council.
And how do we reconcile that with Zelensky being Jewish?
Well, how do we reconcile the fact that Israel's been supporting Ukraine since 2014, and that there was, I believe, 2 General Assembly resolutions in response to this denouncing Nazism, and there were 2 countries that voted against it, the U.S. and Ukraine. So look, and Israel's always happy to work with ultra-right-wing groups, despite, of course, all the history. So I don't see that as, how do I reconcile it? My question is, how does he reconcile it? I can only tell you what's happening. He has to reconcile it. But these groups, what is important is not only the Azov Battalion, but the official government in Ukraine, Kiev, or Kyiv, as some people pronounce it, under Poroshenko. One of the first things they did, they declared the Russian language, that it could not be taught in the schools anymore. They had to teach. Okay, this flipped out the Russian ethnic population in the Donbass. Okay, they at some point declare their independence because they're freaked out by that. They're freaked out by this Azov Battalion, who openly called for the ethnic cleansing of Russians. And there was this huge massacre, which again, people don't talk about, in Odessa. I believe it was in 2014, could have been in 2015, but it was early on, where scores of ethnic Russians were burned alive in this trade union building in Odessa, okay? So the ethnic Russians felt like they were under attack, and they declared independence. And then in response to them declaring independence, the government in Kiev began attacking that region. And there has been a conflict, an armed conflict between Kiev and the Donbass region for 8 years now. 14,000 people have died in that conflict. 80% of them are in the Donbass. That is to say, yes, it has been there is crossfire going both ways, but the biggest casualties are on the Russian ethnic side in the Donbass. Now, at some point, Russia, which by the way, started to absorb hundreds of thousands of migrants from that region who were fleeing this battle, they did begin supporting those republics, but only after those republics declared independence, and only after that war broke out, a war which affected Russia, because again, they had to absorb the town of Rostov.
So in all, just to put a fine point on it, all the fighting that we hear about in Donbass that preceded the current war going on and so on, you would lay the blame for that primarily on Ukraine, not on Russia.
Yes, absolutely. And you know who spoke really articulately on this to the day he died recently is Stephen F. Cohen, who was one of the great Russian experts, taught at Princeton University. He was a Sovietologist. He was actually good friends with Gorbachev. He was actually an advisor to Gorbachev. And one of the things he was trying to explain to the day he died was that, yes, I mean, you cannot say, because they always say the Russian-backed separatists. Well, he would always say, well, yeah, but the backing came after, right? It wasn't that Russia came in and did this. No, this happened because the government in Kiev was reactionary, because it was racist against ethnic Russians. And as a result, people died, a war broke out, 14,000 people were killed. And again, many.
But we do, right? But it is, Russia did arm and get involved in the conflict in territorial Ukraine.
They did after it began, but they felt that they needed to support these people under attack. And that part of it does not seem illegitimate to me. Again, there's hundreds of thousands of migrants coming across the border. Again, I try to say, look, how would we feel if there was a government in Mexico that Russia helped install, and it began attacking the English-speaking population of Mexico? Let's assume they had a region with a bunch of English speakers, and the government didn't like them, and the war broke out, and thousands of people were killed, mostly civilians, and a bunch started migrating across the border into the U.S., hundreds of thousands. The U.S. would not take this lightly. They would do something about it. And Russia did. And for years, and by the way, there was a resolution that was agreed to deal with this called the Minsk Agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, which the Security Council of the United Nations unanimously approved, including, of course, the United States approved it, which Ukraine never abided by. And part of that agreement was that there are not to be armed groups in the Donbass, that Ukraine would stop attacking Donbass, and that the Donbass and those two republics, Lugansk and Donetsk, could move towards autonomy, a certain level of autonomy. I mean, the borders of Ukraine would remain, but it was agreed to that they would have an election and they could vote and have a certain autonomous republic.